Okay, sounds good.
All right. Welcome to everybody in the next chapter in our webinar series. This one is a little bit different from our previous ones. We've done a lot on fintechs and generally assessing fintech programs. But when you get somebody who has this much knowledge and experience in traditional and community banking, you don't say no to the opportunity. So, without further ado, I'd like to thank Justina Rousseau of K2 Integrity for joining us. Justina, please, before we get started, just give us a little bit of color about your background. You have a lot of extensive experience in both consulting and banking, so we'd love to hear about that before we kick off.
Perfect. Thanks, George. So, Justina Russo, Senior Managing Director at K2 Integrity, financial crimes consulting firm based out of both New York City and Washington, D.C., with a global footprint. I have been in financial crimes for just under 30 years now, anywhere and everywhere from first line, second line, third line of defense. Within the financial institution industry for just about, I would say, 20 to 25 years, and then more recently in the last under 5 years in consulting. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Yeah, and obviously you've been doing this for a while.
Hmm.
My first question to you would be, given that you've done both consulting and worked at banks, love to hear all the different exams that you've conducted. What sort of issues have you seen that sort of come up across the board, whether it be at larger institutions or community
Yeah.
banks, and also any differences between the two types of institutions?
Sure. I think it sort of across the board. One of the biggest issues, kind of control deficiencies that I've seen, even go as far as like common root causes, whether this is the largest of the financial institutions to smaller community banks, right? And by the way, I've been saying this for years now. It's all related to the data that you have at your fingertips and how you're leveraging that data, right? Data drives so much from risk assessments to proper KYC and due diligence to transaction monitoring that you really do need to ensure not only accurate data, but then it's also that accurate use of data. How are you actually using it? And so that use of data, in my opinion, is becoming just increasingly more important, particularly in the community banking space, but really, really more broadly. And a good example, I think, that I would give to that is, how are you using KYC data as part of your transaction monitoring process and vice versa? And how is that data helping to inform banks' overall risk appetite? The risk assessment process from an AML CFT to a sanctions risk assessment perspective, like how are you leveraging that data? Customer risk ratings to even even looking sort of at those activities that you may outsource and what is the data that they're able to provide you and vice versa. So data is definitely a big one, but it really does depend from an issues perspective, what we kind of see across the board, failures in the KYC process, failures in the TM process. But this whole data topic and how things are feeding back and forth to each other and really bringing that holistic program together seems to be at the core sort of thread.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And having both been in consulting and banking, and now in the fintech space, I think that's definitely something that exists across the board. Uh,
Yeah.
I think everybody's always trying to, especially when you have a lot of mergers and acquisitions, everyone's trying to link their systems, and so it adds all of these other fun little wrinkles for people. How would
Most
you?
definitely.
How would you categorize the process in terms of, let's say, how manual does it seem that people are doing this right now? And have you found any good solutions for the best way to address all of this kind of data disparity and bring that all together at your fingertips?
Yeah, it all definitely depends on the institution, right? First and foremost. the level of technology and data controls that the institution has are going to play a huge role in that, right? I would say for some, it can be quite manual from an oversight perspective, particularly, right? And how are you overseeing technology tools that you're leveraging? How are you overseeing, that your data partners are getting you the right data to run an effective AML program, an effective sanctions program, and this partnership that you really have to have with the varying different partners within your institution, right? To make sure that at the end of the day, all data that you have, all issues that you are trying to solve are really being fixed, regardless of kind of where those data controls or where those other controls may lie. You asked a different part in that question too around, there's a lot of service providers out there that help with these different areas, right? I don't necessarily try to promote one versus another, but it is something that everybody should be looking at. What are my options out there to be able to leverage service providers, to leverage more AI, to help automate tasks so that you're really focused on the highest of risk items, right, versus the lower of risk tasks. Tasks are important within an AML program, but I can't remember now the year the Department of Justice did come out with information that they were focused on, that institutions have to start focusing on the higher risk activities and less on those lower risk activities. And I think it's an important part of the oversight, but also an effective implementation of your program, right? Where are your key activities focusing? And leveraging those partners and leveraging those service providers that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you can't, you might not be able to make any recommendations. I might make a shameless plug for Blanc and how we help
Yeah.
lots of institutions do that. Moving on to some potentially positive news in the exam environment.
Yeah.
Since the start of this month, the OCC's updated BSA AML standards for community bank exams have gone into effect. Now, this approach, for those who don't know, is a little bit more tailored, which is sort of designed to reduce the exam scope for many of these institutions. Can you speak a little bit to those changes and how you think it'll impact the community bank industry as a whole?
Sure. Well, a couple of things I think that I'd highlight. Whenever changes like this go into play, it's sort of like you kind of got to wait and see what it looks like. So we're in that kind of wait and see what it looks like phase. But I think there's something that everyone does need to recognize as part of this, is that this is around the examination process itself, right? So first point I'd emphasize is the regulations for community banks have not changed. Those underlying regs are still there, right? This is updated. These updated standards are examination processes and examination procedures to be more tailored, right? And it's giving community banks hopefully that the reduction of and the burden, right, that can be a part of an examination process by just re-emphasizing. I think that they use the word emphasizing when they publish this, but I'll say re-emphasizing the fact that the examiners do have discretion to place reliance in certain areas, and that reliance could be on internal audit of your community bank or external audits if you go outside. From an independent testing perspective, they've got that discretion to be able to decide. That's always technically been there, right? Technically, it's always been there. It's been in the FFIC exam manual, but just kind of re-emphasizing that discretion that they have is an important piece. And that will hopefully, there's a piece though, if you really read into the underlying documentation that was published, there is an area where those examiners, they're not just going to automatically, right, leverage those results, they need to make that determination. And that determination needs to be made as to whether or not they are comfortable with the audit program or the independent auditor that you have brought in to be able to leverage. And that typically, especially in a year one, is going to mean that they have to get comfortable with that. So they're going to have to test some of the same types of files that the auditors have reviewed to say, did I come up with the same conclusions they did, or did they miss something? And now I can't, right, leverage that. So this first year might not feel as less burdensome as it has been in the past, and it may take a cycle or two. That's my personal opinion. And then I think it's kind of a little bit of a wait and see, right? A little wait and see to how much scope they really start focusing on. I can see, as someone who has done, independent audits for community banks independently as part of K2, where the examiners start using a little bit more discretion in how they change the scope to really focus on those high risk activities, right? Taking the risk assessment even aside for a second, and risk assessments are really important, so I don't want to blow over that, but what is the bank's highest risk activities, right? And is the scope of the exam really focused on that? Is this core community banking kind of bread and butter products and services, from, your traditional depository types of accounts to lending, et cetera? Or is it an institution that is in the fintech space? Right, George, the world that you're very familiar with. Are you doing banking as a service? Focusing on things like that, because that risk is then elevated to that possibly that part of the business, and really focusing on what they're looking at. I do think that should be a result of this new guidance and the new community bank procedures that have come out around examinations. But again, I think time will tell. Time will tell.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of very excellent points in there, and I think ultimately, I think it's good to start from where you did, which is that this is a reminder that they've always had the ability for discretion. So having said that, a lot of the same people who are at these agencies have been there for many years. So the
Yeah.
idea that they're going to step out of their comfort zone and go, okay, now we're going to do this completely differently is it might be a little bit too soon to start celebrating the the new regulatory environment, correct?
Yeah, I could see in the transaction testing piece of it a little relief out of the gate, though. We've seen requests for large volumes of transactional files too, whether that's KYC files, like large numbers to go through and review the KYC files, independently. Maybe that becomes a smaller sample in the beginning, and they grow it to see how systemic an issue may be, or if it's a one-off. I think there's steps like that we could see the examination teams taking that could help. And it helps the examination team as well be more efficient in their examinations, but it really will help kind of take some of that burden off of the community banks themselves as well.
Yeah, and I think this also comes back nicely to your initial point about data and the ability to
Yep.
replicate it, right? So if
Yeah.
you have an internal audit team that's, conducted some kind of an examination, and then a third party examiner comes in and, they come to two different conclusions, but it's actually because you're not pulling your data correctly, and you're not,
Yeah.
it's the importance of being able to replicate exactly what it was you pulled the first time becomes absolutely crucial, right? And so you're
Mm-hmm.
having your reporting and your data lined up is pretty key there.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. Data's king in this
Yeah.
world that we live in.
I think if I had to rename this webinar after the fact, that would be the tagline. Um, so one of the other pieces that changed is the discontinuation of the money laundering risk
Mm,
system data collection, ironically, I
yeah.
guess. Our previous webinars have been more in the fintech space, so there are plenty of people who are going to see this who may not be familiar with the MLR system, and others who just may need a refresher. So if you could just give a little bit of a baseline on on what the MLR is, what its purpose was, and why you believe they may have let it go?
Sure. So MLR, standing for Money Laundering Risk System, it was a data collection method that the OCC utilized, right, for community banks to submit certain data to the OCC, and that would then be used to help target, right, both examination processes and other things, quite frankly. I think the decision that it has been burdensome a little bit on the industry is probably the right decision. So good to see, I think. Where we're going to see this pick up then a little bit is in that examination process, right? So because we're not having to, the community banks are no longer having to submit the data in there, where and how you would expect the data that was typically sent over to be really analyzed a little bit to help in that scoping part of the examination process is going to be in the examination process, right? The OCC even came out and said that, right? That this is where some of that data is going to be, and not necessarily 100% collected, but where that some of that data would have been leveraged and will be leveraged in the scoping timeframe and the scoping period of these exams. So don't necessarily think immediately that you're not going to have that data available. You probably are going to have that data available. Typically you do. But it's going to be more at that point in time, right? And I would say 99% of the institutions have always had that data readily available at the time of an examination anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like so far a lot of these have been less, there might be some burden reduction, but for now it seems like it's more of like a shifting of
Yeah.
responsibilities to maybe like a slightly different time frame than a true like relaxation of the regulatory environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And depending on how often your examination team is coming in, which is also something that was in the new community bank procedures for examinations, is allowing the examiners to use a bit of discretion around the cycle examination and what to carry forward from a prior exam into this particular exam and the conclusions needed. Depending on how that all happens with the examiner and the examination team, could then be that data that you've provided to the MLR system is this big chunk of data. But for this year, we're going to need this chunk. And for next year, maybe it looks like that chunk, depending again on what the scope ends up being for each examination.
Yeah, no, that makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. Um, so along with these OCC changes, last month the House Financial Services Committee also introduced a bill to support de novo bank formation by easing capital requirements, also tailoring regulations to lower risk profiles. And also, it sounded like with the intention of helping the community bank space.
Yeah.
Do you believe that this is, and acknowledging your point before about having to wait and see where things actually go, and unlike the OCC, this is still just this hasn't even made it past the House floor even. Do you believe that we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the regulatory environment? Do you think that the other federal and state regulators might follow suit, or do you think? Well, let's start there, and then I'll toss follow-up questions after.
Yeah, yeah, no, all good. Listen, first off, it's hard to speculate, right? I do think there is a shift, though, generally, in the regulatory environment right now with this administration, and we're seeing a lot of openness, whether it's fintechs applying for bank charters to even the mergers and the acquisitions of traditional community banks, right? Let alone de novo bank and formation and some of the easing of capital requirements to make these things happen. There's generally, I think, a sense in the administration, and I would say in the regulatory environment that we're in right now, to kind of ease some of that and let the institutions kind of do what, frankly, I think some institutions at least have wanted to do for a few years now. Um, Again, hard to speculate how this is all going to play out by all means. Will it go past this administration? I don't know. I think there's going to be pieces of it that will, and there's going to be pieces that will get kind of tightened and potentially reined in. It is a little bit of that. Let's wait and see. Hard to tell fully. But I can also say, like, a lot of institutions are embracing this right now, right? Really embracing it and trying to figure out the best way forward. I think that's good. I think it's good as long as you're taking a risk-based approach to it and you're really thinking about the risks for your organization. Um, you know, Getting a brand new banking license or a charter is not an easy task, and it means full risk programs and risk stripes that you own, right? So as long as I think the right steps are being taken, you're engaging the right counsel, you're engaging the right firms who can help guide you in these areas, like consulting firms like A2. I think it can be quite beneficial for the industry.
Yeah, and I think obviously everyone sort of looks at this administration in particular and goes, will this actually survive past it? But one of the
Yeah,
points I kind of like that you made is I think if enough entities start changing their approach based on these new regs, it's going to be hard to, sort of go back and start saying, okay, now you have to start doing all these other things again, because at a certain point, companies need to plan past 4-year administrations and
yeah,
be able to do business. So
thousand
there
percent.
might almost be an opportunity that if everybody kind of embraces this slightly lower model now, that it'll be much harder to rein it back in and start throwing a whole bunch of other regs at all these institutions.
Yeah. But prepare yourself for, I think that is what you're saying and is what I'm saying, George, is prepare yourselves for beyond this administration. Prepare yourselves for whatever future state. And that means that especially when it comes to AML, BSA, AML, CFT, and sanctions risks, those risks don't go away because your administration changes. Those risks are there with, there's no status, no limit on statutes there, right? And so make sure that as you're thinking about that from a growth perspective with um, your board, right? Your key management, that you're thinking past and that you're building the right programs for both future state and for long-term state.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important takeaways right now, especially with the amount of sort of uncertainty that we've discussed.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd be remiss if I didn't go back to one of the other things you brought up earlier in the discussion, which is AI compliance. I
Mm.
think as of right now, um, there's no technical AI compliance departments. I mean, some people are obviously building them out. Um, but I'd just be curious to hear about how you believe, because my feeling is eventually, if not already, like certain BSA AML teams or
Mhm.
AFC teams or FCC, however you're calling them, however you're calling it in your institution. I think eventually AI is going to be just another part of that. And I think a lot of that probably comes down to, how it's making the decisions, how it
Yep.
is pulling the data, to the points we talked about earlier. So I'd love to hear a little bit, of your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll start by saying I'm not an AI expert, okay? But I have friends that are. um, I think you have to embrace AI sooner than later. I think everyone should, regardless of firm, including our examination teams to the extent that they can, right? That said, it is about having the right oversight is the word that I use, right? But it's control testing. It's poking and prodding AI to make sure that it is giving you the right results. right? On an ongoing basis. It's making sure that you can sit back and be comfortable that you understand exactly, what is happening, the algorithms behind it. Now, I say exactly what, not from a technical perspective, but what is the purpose, right? What is the purpose of this? What controls and what data needs to be ingested in to make the decisions? And then at the end of the day, is the output what you expected based on all of that? And how are you testing that to make sure, again, on that ongoing basis, not just a one-time basis? Because especially as you get into generative AI, right? You've got to be looking at it on a repeat, almost real time basis to make sure that it is doing what you expect. And that's going to be the piece, I think, that will be a little challenging for institutions to really understand, how do I do that effectively? And then how do I make sure that my examination teams and others, right, independent audit, others are comfortable with how we're handling this, because it is so new to all of us in the industry, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then with the last few minutes, I do want to leave time for questions if anybody in the panel has anything they want to ask. All right. This question is, are there any resources on the K2 Integrity site to prepare for what's to expect in regard to changes?
Um, Great question. I don't know that there is anything out there, but guess what? We'll get it out there now for you. There's a lot of resources available. We've got a lot of different white papers and links to publications and things where we've spoken, webinars, etc. But I'll make sure to go back and see if there's nothing specific to this topic that we've got more out there readily available to you. Um, and if you haven't yet read through, right, the OCC's new procedures for the examination teams, I highly recommend that you do and kind of do a comparison. Use AI to do a comparison if you wish, like a little AI there, to be able to say, well, what's really different here from what I should expect from prior examinations and things like that, I think will be useful for people.
Yeah, I think it's always best to go back to the regs before you're asking someone else's opinion of them to see if you actually agree with their interpretation of it. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Having said that, obviously, I think myself and Justina would both be more than willing to answer questions. So if anybody happens to view
Absolutely.
this, later on, you are more than happy to reach out to us. We will post our emails along with the webinar. And with that, I think we're basically up on time. So Justina, once
Yeah.
again, like to really extend our appreciation for this. I think it was a very valuable lesson about keeping your program and especially your data as
Yeah.
we discussed up to par.
Yeah.
And
That's exactly right.
and so thank you once again, and thank you for everybody for joining.
Thank you.